Today, we are excited to welcome Dr. Cherie Strachan. Dr. Strachan is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. Her political science research combines interest in political participation, voluntary civic and political organizations, and political communication. Recent work explores the Me Too movement and women's political ambition, as well as the effects of partisan polarization, rudeness, and civility on political engagement. She is also co-author of the textbook Why Don't Women Rule the World and co-editor of the APSA published resource Strategies for Navigating Graduate School and Beyond. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Strachan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. It's part of the Bliss Institute's mission. We are focused on civic and political engagement through hands-on learning, through presentations and events. And we're supposed to do that not only on campus with our students, but with the broader community. So inviting me to do these things helps me fulfill the mission of the Institute, and I appreciate it. And I've only been back in Ohio for about 2.5 years now. So I try to say yes whenever I get an invitation. I don't have slides because I thought I could move through a summary more quickly and provide the broad strokes of what we're starting, as we do the post-election analysis, what we think as political scientists and sort of data crunching, what we think has happened. I thought I could move through that more quickly if I just talk with you. And sometimes people get tied to slides and, it takes, I have to move through every single slide. So I thought I'd just talk with you and make sure I save plenty of time for conversation. So of course, I'm sure you've all been watching the news and are up to date on some of these preliminary things, but Trump obviously has won the Electoral College 312 to 226. That makes it look like a much stronger showing because of the Electoral College than it actually was. Although Trump is the first Republican in a really long time to win the popular vote. It looks like, and they're not completely done counting ballots everywhere, right? But so there might still be some shifts in the actual number, but it looks like he's really only won the popular vote by about 1%. The way the votes played out in the battleground, sort of in the Electoral College votes, and particularly in those battleground states where it looks like you're sort of building up this artificial landslide. It's really not a landslide. But Trump did at the margins have enough coattails, obviously, to help enough Republicans across that finish line so that they're going to keep control of the House, and Republicans have taken control of the Senate. What turnout everywhere, by the way, was down everywhere except the battleground states, where the candidates were just dumping tons and tons of money and had tons of people on the ground to get people out to the polls. And so the preliminary analysis, the story that seems to be happening is that the people who stayed home and were less enthusiastic were much more harmful to Harris. She underperformed Biden in a lot of places. Than it was to Trump. So Trump's voters were more enthusiastic. And then there's also, I'll get to this in a minute, there is also, Trump did manage to peel off a little bit, particularly with low socioeconomic status and low propensity voters. So people that don't always show up, but were more enthusiastic in this particular election than maybe in some others, and were brought out to vote for him. So what happened? I mean, we want to go, the polls were wrong again. Not entirely wrong, because that popular vote is still showing a closer race than what it looks like. But again, the pollsters underestimated support for Trump and overestimated enthusiasm for Harris. What's wrong with polls? It's really hard. Polls are based on the statistics of pulling a random sample. So you're always going to have a margin of error. There's always like a 5% chance. You go for a 95% confidence level because otherwise you do a census and it would be impossibly expensive. There's always a 5% chance that you're just completely wrong, which is why we like to aggregate and look at more than one poll. And then there's always a margin of error. Like, well, it's, it's 95% or it's 50% plus or minus 2, right? Which is kind of the boundary around that. That's your best guess, but there's still some wiggle room there. But it's based on being able to make predictions like that are based on the statistics, on the science of being able to pull a random sample. So even under the best of circumstances, there's a chance you're wrong. And we try to put some boundaries on it. We are having increasingly difficult time because of cell phones. I have a 518 area code from back when I was in grad school. If they haven't, like, who do they call? With cell phones. I still get calls. I used to live in Michigan for 15 years. I still get calls from pollsters who think I still live in Michigan and want to poll me. I always answer the phone. It's bad karma for me personally not to answer the phone when there's a pollster on the other end. But most Americans don't feel that way, right? Most of them are having it set to spam, don't want to pick up those calls. So it's really hard to figure out how to pull a random sample when we don't have landlines anymore, where it was really easy to just randomly pull even private numbers. You could randomly sample all the residential phone numbers in a particular geographic area. The best practice that we're sort of figuring out right now is hard addresses. So we should send people a letter, pull a random sample based on residences and addresses, and send people a letter and ask them to participate, like maybe in a Qualtrics or an online. Will you send us contact information or an email address? And then we can send you this place to log in and take a poll. It's expensive to do it that way. You're just adding layers of how to get in touch with people. And so not everybody's using those best practices. And anytime you shift away from a random sample, your estimates are going to be potentially just even more wrong. The other thing is getting people to answer those polls. There's self-selection into the process. The low propensity, low socioeconomic status voters that were more enthusiastic and upset and wanted to turn out in this election are exactly the people who really don't trust elites. They don't trust, like, if I say I'm a college professor, I'm like, I'd like to have you answer a survey. They're like, I don't want to talk to you. Distrust of elites, distrust of the media, distrust of academics, and also just working 60 hours a week, right? And, at a low paying job where you're just tired and you're like, that's the last thing I want to do when I get home at the end of the day is pick up the phone and talk to a pollster. So they are much less likely to answer the phone and respond, or to just throw that letter when you send it away, which then you have to weight the people who do answer it that fit that demographic. And because you don't get enough of them to answer, and it just makes things hard to predict. And then think about the people. This is why I think the Iowa poll that predicted there would be a gender gap and that Harris had a chance to actually take Iowa. Think about the people who are most likely to go, yes, I want to answer your poll when they're contacted. More educated, angry and upset. Angry, upset suburban women who are upset about the Dobbs decision still, right? Were like, yes, let me tell you why I'm mad. And they were much more likely to pick up the phone or to respond to the letter. So we're just having a lot of problems with polls. Trump slightly overperformed. And the MAGA base is going to show up and is loyal. Like, the Trump voters are loyal, even though some Republicans found his behavior disqualifying. That's not going to alienate the base, and that was calculated in. The people they had trouble predicting were the low socioeconomic status. We're starting to call this the diploma divide, where those voters from low socioeconomic status are starting to shift into the more firmly into the Republican Party. We think that at least in this particular election, they overperformed. This has happened across the globe in post-pandemic elections. In every country that's had an election, those low propensity, low socioeconomic status voters have thrown out the incumbents in every place there's been an election, except for France, where it was a clear, right, very, very far right rejection, right, of the far right in France. But everywhere else, regardless of whether they're conservative or liberal, because of inflation and the cost of living, right? If you're making $15 an hour in the United States, I can absorb, on my salary, I don't like it, but I can absorb the inflation and the cost of living and the prices at the grocery store. People making $15 an hour in Ohio can't. And they were angry, and there were enough of them that were mobilized to show up to make a difference. We think this is just the headwinds of what Democrats were up against, not just in the United States, but any incumbent party across the globe. And we just didn't capture it because those voters don't answer polls. Harris underperformed compared to even Biden in 2020, and lost support from key demographic groups. So you'll see like lost support with Hispanic men, lost support with young men. But most of those voters also, if you run the crosstabs that she lost support with, women, even some low income women were like, Dobbs is going to push me right to vote for Democrats. But people who weren't inspired or mad about something else, the low SES voters, that when it cuts across Hispanic or it cuts across young men, were pulling away from Harris. And so she lost support. They went to Trump or they stayed home. And then there were a chunk of voters, Muslim voters, like for example, in Dearborn, Michigan, or youth voters who were very upset about Palestine, either did a protest vote for Stein or wrote somebody in or stayed home, right? So that's enough at the margins, right, to have flipped all of this. And then Trump, from those low propensity voters are not the ones like in the Moreno Brown race that are going to split their ticket, right? Low propensity voters are like, I'm voting for Trump because I'm mad about the economy and I'm voting for the Republican, and they download the Republican sample ballot and they vote it. They're not paying a lot of attention to other races. They're not sort of historic voters that have been loyal to Brown all along and are hard to tear away from him because he's been their incumbent. They just go Trump, straight ticket. And because Trump overperformed in Ohio, we had him coming in at a 7% gap, and he actually performed at a 9%, right? 9% gap. If it hadn't been that extra 2%, we were watching in real time, right? How tight that Moreno race, lots and lots of Republicans were splitting their ticket and voting for Trump and Brown. If Trump hadn't overperformed with those low propensity voters, Brown probably would have squeaked it out, right? So those coattails flipped that race and took Brown out. It was incredibly tight. And we also think that those low propensity voters that were looking at the sample ballot are at least in part responsible, not entirely responsible, for why the constitutional ballot initiative went down, because they're just looking at the sample ballot. Now, there were some other reasons, the misleading language. Maybe people are just frustrated with how many times they've been asked to vote on a ballot initiative about gerrymandering in Ohio, and maybe they're just like sick of it. But when you just poll on gerrymandering, not with the language that was in the ballot, but if you ask Ohioans if they like gerrymandering, overwhelmingly, they will tell you no, they don't like it. It's not even a partisan issue. Nobody likes it. So the combination of low propensity voters and the misleading language and those Trump coattails, we think also had something to do with taking out that ballot initiative. So in many ways, it's, the polls didn't get these nuances right. And again, we can say, pollsters whiffed it, right? It looks like a much bigger win for Trump and Republicans than many people sort of anticipated. Republicans have once again solidified control with no chance, unless DeWine, has promised to maybe try to intervene and get some changes in the district drawing process. But there's not strong hope for that. And so it looks like solidified districts drawn to support Republicans are going to kind of stay in place in Ohio, and the trifecta is in place in Ohio, but also at the national level, which was more of a surprise to people. But given like that this is a 1% popular vote, like the electorate didn't, like, it's not like we went to 2024 and added something and the entire electorate changed. This is still the same electorate that supported Biden in 2020, It's still the same electorate that suppressed a red wave in 2022. It was just this enthusiasm, some protest votes, and some upset, right? Just kind of changed turnout at the margins that resulted in a lot of success for Republicans. So one possible result of that, and then I'll wrap this up because I'm kind of cutting into your Q&A time. One possible result of that is that the MAGA base of the Republican Party does expect traction and action on issues that are not necessarily popular with, beyond that MAGA base of the Republican Party. And so mass deportations, eliminating the Department of Education and things like that, could, to the extent that or tariffs, to the extent that those are, that Trump follows through and puts those in place, it might cause overreach, like a perception of overreach, and like that's not what we wanted. We just don't want to pay these prices at the grocery store, and our used cars are too expensive. So there could be some overreach and potentially some pushback in the next midterms. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Cherie, thank you so much. Certainly a complicated situation, and able to share such great insights into what happened these past few months. You mentioned many people kind of staying home and the voter turnout. How do we crack that nut and find a way to get folks to come out and really engage in this process?
Yeah, so there were times in the United States when voter turnout was like at 80%, back in the 1800s, early 1900s. It's harder to get people to turn out to vote when we rely so heavily on the ad, the superficial ad campaigns like that come at us and saturate our airwaves every 2 years and every 4 years. There's actually research that low propensity, so there was research by a woman who studied Hispanic low propensity voters. If you maintain a permanent infrastructure in minority, low propensity turnout, low socioeconomic neighborhood communities, like an old-fashioned precinct headquarters, right? They called it a community center. And you're there all the time, and there's paid staff, and there's people to come, like when you have an issue, there's someone there to help you with it or talk about it, feeds information up to the party leaders about what you're upset about, feeds it down. You can actually increase voter turnout by 7%. It's the person who did that research is, I don't know for certain, is probably a Democrat and probably left-leaning, and did research for her dissertation on Hispanic voters. Republicans actually followed through and did that, and they had those kinds of centers in place, and some places across the country where they were trying to kind of flip some sort of people that like Hispanic voters and African American voters who would kind of traditionally be seen as Democrats. And they were in place. And as soon as Trump won the nomination, they shut them down because they needed to direct the money to, the things that they thought were more important. Yeah, but we know how to increase, like political scientists know how to increase consistent voter turnout, and it's not through an ad campaign. Getting people to spend money on that is hard.
So let's talk ads, media, the information that's out there, especially with social media. There's just so much information and so much misinformation. How do we work through what's out there to truly have kind of an educated voter base in factual information?
Yeah. I don't know that I 100% have the answer to that. I do think that like, so I teach a class on civic engagement and youth political participation. And I do think that the skill set that we need to identify misinformation, propaganda, how to deal with podcasts, how to deal with TikTok, is something that we need to start embedding in K through 12 and in college in a much more aggressive way. But I also tell my students, like, my answer to this, like, if they're like, well, where do I get my information? There's so much information. I'm like, could you please read a newspaper? Could you please read I consider myself a really good BS detector on both sides. When they're exaggerating or when there's misinformation, I'm like, that's not true. Ding, ding, ding. It's not because I have a PhD in political science. right? It's because I read a newspaper every day, and I switch with, I want to be able to talk to my conservative students and understand their concerns. I want to be able to talk to my liberal students and understand their concerns. We have a master's degree in applied politics, so those students, there are not very many independents, right? In that master's program, they pretty much know what they think. So I might switch. I might read the Wall Street Journal one day and the New York Times the next, and I'll switch up which op-eds I'm reading. But I make sure I read a newspaper every day. 30 minutes, you will process. So don't watch cable news, even CNN. I mean, unless you want to be entertained, right? Or there's some breaking story. You will process so much more information in 30 minutes of reading a newspaper than 30 minutes of watching Wolf Blitzer babble on about something, right? And having to fill time because they have a 24-hour news cycle. And I don't like, I try to, we have current events quizzes. We make sure they know they can read newspapers for free at the library. Like we're trying, but yeah, read a newspaper.
What are some of those key things you look for that send the alarm off that this is a biased piece, even if it looks like it's coming from a legit news source?
Um, anything that, I mean, if you're reading the newspapers and you kind of know the political sort of landscape, anything that looks like it's a partisan spin to like, right, so that if this story is true, it makes Republicans look horrible. If this story is true, it makes Democrats look horrible. It's probably spin or not true. You can also look at the, anyone who's not a paid journalist, right? Like the podcasters, the cable news, they're trying to outrage you so that you log into the next podcast. They're trying to outrage you so that you stay, because they're making their money not necessarily off you and yours, even if it's a subscription, they're making their money off ad sales and clicks, right? So anybody that's not paid to try to get it right, is trying to outrage you and get you upset so that you'll continue to use their media outlet. And then you can also look for, is it a .com? Is it a, .net? Is it a .org? Like you can look at the, sort of the advert or the links and things like that. But anybody that's not paid to try to be accurate and is going to get dinged when they're not accurate has another agenda.
We're at a time where the policies proposed, the talking points on both sides are very polarized. How do you see kind of going forward an opportunity to come back to being less polarized between the two parties and kind of coming together more in that middle?
That's hard. That's really, really hard. And so, I can do it on a college campus. I can do it in the community when I set the ground rules for how people are going to talk to each other. We have deliberative discussion sessions where we randomly assign students on campus. They talked about immigration policy and had to come up with a consensus recommendation by the end of the semester. So randomly assigned at Akron, you're going to get, students from Akron, students from Stowe. You're going to get conservatives and liberals, and they do just fine. And we actually grade them on civility, their capacity for civility and deliberation rather than what they recommend. When I work with community partners and they want to have those kinds of conversations across difference, I can bring, I don't grade them with a rubric, but I can bring the ground rules and talk about it with them in advance. And so we need more places. And clearly there was, even in the most polarizing sort of Congress that we just had in the Biden administration, they managed to get some major pieces of legislation through. It's just not what we see. They do it behind the scenes because they don't want to alienate their base. So we 100% have the capacity. Being civil, the ground rules of civility are no different than politeness. You're probably most polite. I'm most polite to my mother because we disagree about a ton of stuff, and I want to be able to go home for Christmas dinner, or, take my son home for Christmas dinner, right? We know what the markers of politeness and civility are when we want to maintain a relationship. Absolutely, right? No name calling, no interruption. Like if I call you a nasty name in public in front of people, I'm purposefully severing a relationship. We know not to do that when we care. It is not rocket science. And so, what we need to do is hold politicians, instead of the base encouraging them to be rude because they don't want them to work together, right? We need to reward politicians when they are civil and model that. I'm working on it. It's really hard. It's really hard.
Do you have any hope for online voting practices anytime in the near future for the United States? And if so, what would be the potential positives or negatives for the US political landscape?
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I think that the one benefit obviously would be accessibility. It would make it a lot easier for people. I voted early in Summit County on a Friday afternoon and still stood in line for 40 minutes. Like, that's not a major disincentive for me. I can leave work, I can go stand in line. It's really important to me. But 40 minutes in line would be a disincentive to a lot of people. So, it would be much, much more accessible. Given rampant concerns about security, even though those concerns are not based in reality, right? About the ability to flip, right, and hack the voting machines. Um, I would have concerns about the perception of how secure those are, right? And it would just feed ammunition for people that want to say that there's fraud. So that piece, I think, would have to be substantially, like, they don't even want us to drop ballots um, you know, in drop boxes, like, without an ID, and claim that that's a problem. So I would want to like slow down on that, just to slow down the conspiracy theory and kind of think that piece through first.
Can you talk a bit more about the Electoral College? Any chance of seeing changes in that process in the future?
Oh my goodness. I guess if Americans really, really get upset, but if but it is such an onerous process to amend. Like, how long has the Equal Rights Amendment been floating around out there, right? It is such an onerous process to amend the Constitution. It would take such a groundswell of organizing and a groundswell of support to get to coordinate that across enough states to have an amendment to the Constitution. Like, if you're hoping for a change, um, that might not be where I'm happy to support it. Um, but if you want some more immediate change, that might not be where I would put the eggs in my basket. That's in the basket I would put my eggs in, I guess. Yeah.
So let's talk about if you do want change. What are some recommendations of where you would put your time and energy over the next few years?
So one of the things that I strongly like, especially students that, are community members that are unhappy with their choices, please start voting in primaries. Please start voting in primaries. The reason why we wind up with candidates who we perceive to be right at that sort of pitch to the far left or the far right, or not to the center, or that we're not happy with, is because about 18% of Americans vote in primaries. If you want better candidates and better choices, right, this is the process that's in place with primaries. It's what we have. And we have to be more involved in voting those primaries, or you are ceding the ground to people who are much more ideologically intense. Um, the other thing I would say is, there are lots of ways to be involved in politics, civics and politics outside of elections, and that also bolster turnout. And those are like the civic infrastructure is dramatically eroded. If you go to like a League of Women Voters meeting, I would, when I go to one, I'm 54 and I'm typically the youngest person in the room, right? Civic organizing, flooding back into organizations like the League of Women Voters, or similar kinds of organizations that do civic work all year long, that do voter registration drives, that host, informational events, that host and promote informed participation. Um, uh, and again, those things take time and energy, but they they're not rocket science. right? We are all look what all of you did with Zoom, right? It's not rocket science. It just takes time and energy to show up. And so I would suggest being involved in those kinds of organizations. And they don't, it's nice if they're political, but they don't always even have to be political, overtly political, because if you have the civic organizing skills, to do things for an organization that has a broad membership base of people that come together regularly in meetings and do things, then you have the capacity to flip that and turn it to voter participation or protest politics, nonviolent civil disobedience when you want to. Classic example that political scientists will use of that is the American Legion. When the GI Bill was first proposed, it was a stingy, and it was proposed because they were worried about tanking the economy after World War II, with everyone coming back from the draft and flooding back into manual labor jobs. They were like, labor supply is going to be through the roof, and we don't have enough jobs for all these guys. Let's send some of them to college. But the people that wrote the initial bill were college presidents who were really snobby and didn't want riffraff on their campuses, and members of Congress who were stingy. And the American Legion had camps across the entire country because of the draft, right? Because everybody knew somebody or was related to somebody. Huge populations. What did they use the American Legion for? For the most part, recreation, a place to hang out and drink cheap beer and have a party on, like a dance on Friday night, right? For the most part, along with some patriotic, ceremonies in between. They got ticked. They organized, rewrote the bill in an incredibly generous way, and lobbied it in every congressional district across the country, and got a bill that was incredibly generous. They wrote low interest housing loans because everybody else needed a house. Low interest, like, what if I don't want to go to college? Entrepreneurial, like small business loans, and low rates of loans for that. They wrote something, trade school, you could go to trade school. They wrote a bill that was much more comprehensive and actually more helpful, and just lobbied the hell out of it. So when you have those kinds of organizations in place and people are already in connection with one another, right? As soon as you care about a political issue, you can flip it and focus on the things you care about.
I think that is a fantastic way to close out our conversation. And so, Dr. Strong, we thank you for helping cut through the noise of
Yeah,
the past few months and even just the past week of what has been happening and what's to come. So, thank you so much for joining us today.
absolutely. Thanks for having me. Thank you.